Well, welcome everyone to today's version of the Gems from the Wisdom Tradition, where we are taking up the topic of a pilgrim's progress. I'll start by reading Carving Your Statue by Plotinus. Withdraw into yourself and look. And if you do not find yourself beautiful yet, act as does the creator of a statue that is to be made beautiful. He cuts away here, he smooths there. He makes this line lighter, this other purer, until a lovely face has grown upon his work. So do you also. Cut away all that is excessive, straighten all that is crooked, bring light to all that is overcast. Labor to make all one glow of beauty, and never cease chiseling your statue until there shall shine out on you from it the godlike or goddess-like splendor of virtue.
Beautiful.
I'd love to introduce all of you to Nicola Johnson. She is someone who was raised in the Christian tradition, decided to become a reverend, and was in fact under the mentorship of the bishop of Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, who told her that he would be able to carry her smoothly through all of the studies that she needed through seminary, and would be able to take her into her reverendship. I'm sure there's a better word than that. And then he had a dream when he was hosting the 50th anniversary of the United Nations, of there being an interfaith table of individuals from all the many religions of the world there at the United Nations. And so he told Nicola that although he was able to carry her forward through her studies into a regular kind of position, he also challenged her with the possibility of going into interfaith work, which he said she was going to have to forge her own way through because there really was no already beaten path. And she took up that challenge and went into interfaith work, which she continued for decades. And among the many, many, many things that she did in that position, she also married hundreds of couples of different faiths and baptized their babies. And she became so convinced that there were so many different paths to the divine that she became extremely open. And she is at the point in her life where her spiritual path has taken her to the point where she is living half time in India in an ashram in Tamil Nadu. So we have a humble pilgrim who yet really has a lot to share with all of us. And we look forward to what she has to say this week when we are celebrating the anniversary of the publication of John Bunyan's book, A Pilgrim's Progress. So Nicola, I hand this over to you.
Thank you. How beautiful. You said so many wonderful things. I think I better go do them. I'm not sure that I've accomplished all those things. I better get back to work. I would just say that for me, my calling or my desire or my longing has always been to tie the threads of the divine together, to find the different portals and to have the experience of different ways of approaching and experiencing the divine. So it's been an extraordinary journey so far. I've been very blessed to have mentors and opportunities in different traditions in different parts of the world, and to get to share it with you today. So thank you. I'm assuming that there has been some reading of the Pilgrim's Progress, but let me just dive right in. So I guess that I would say I would ask, why is the book A Pilgrim's Progress important to us? I think one of the first things to talk about when we enter into this discussion is to have the context, the religious context for this book. The author, John Bunyan, was a Puritan preacher. He was preaching in one of the sort of offshoots of Catholicism and the early stages of the Protestant tradition. And at that time in England, it was acceptable. There was sort of a break as the Church of England was just really developing its roots, and England had left their alliance with the Pope, but they had not yet like fully centered themselves. So there was an allowance for different ideas and different thoughts. And he was one preacher who really brought these thoughts to the forefront. But then in the mid 1600s, the monarchy started back up again. It had a change in how the monarchy was being utilized, and they returned to the Church of England or developed it more thoroughly. And anyone who was speaking in any way that was not in alliance with and in alignment with the Church of England was imprisoned. So he was thrown immediately into prison and spent many years there and did a lot of his writings out of prison. And he really wanted to express what it was to be a journeyer, a seeker, a pilgrim that was not necessarily being led by the church, that was being led in their own, in their own individual journey, and that journey was the underpinning for their understanding and experience of the divine. So his writings, which were very popular then, are still popular today, because we're all still on that same journey, the same obstacles, the same challenges, the same concerns, the same wonderings about where am I going, first of all, and then how do I get there, are as relevant today as they were when he wrote A Pilgrim's Progress. So I think that's one of the beautiful things about this book, is to be able to see something that's endured the times, that really was written in a time when there was so much explosion of thought around religion, and so much has happened from then until now, but still today we find it relevant. I think that's really, it says something about the book. He wrote it in the way that many of the teachings, the sacred teachings from all traditions, are written, in allegory and in sort of a folk tale. And of course, his language with the characters and the locations where the story takes place it's just fun to read. He really had a sense of creativity, which was really wonderful. So how does this relate to us today specifically? The themes, it relates to us because the themes and the obstacles that were common then are still common. And so he wrote from the seeker's perspective of a Christian lens, so through the Christian lens. But I would venture that all of us who have studied different traditions and have walked different paths will know that that journey is similar across traditions. It's not wholly held by just the Christians. We all journey and we all take pilgrimages in our spiritual life and lives that have the same sorts of milestones and pitfalls. And so he wrote, I think, for us to read about somebody else taking the same journey, it's consoling. The missteps, the misgivings, and how do we stay on a path and find our way home, ultimately find our way home? What is home? And this novel has stood the test of time. It reveals the mystery, which I think if we look at across traditions and writings, whether they are sacred teachings or novels and stories that we use, they all talk about the paradox of traditions and of the journey, the struggles, the obstacles, that these kinds of occurrences as we're on our journey are normal. And we start to question, I think, sometimes when we find ourselves in a place where the journey becomes so difficult, we start to ask, am I going down the wrong path? Should I really reconsider how I am taking this journey? And one of the beautiful things in this novel is that that's what's expected. Everybody encounters these, horrific occurrences and situations, and yet they endure. And so the story and the message is that regardless of our path, it's really our intention and what we're willing to hold as the difficulties of a spiritual journey. There's not a simple spiritual journey. Nobody that I know has found a way to do it cleanly. It's messy. It's just messy. And this book shows the trials and tribulations of that messy process. A couple of the familiar themes that we'll find across traditions from this book are the personal cost of salvation. It can cost you relationships and friendships and status, and it can create a lot of havoc in your life. Knowledge that's gained through travel and exposure. One of the best ways for us to expand our horizons and to embrace the path that we're on is to travel and to see how other people are doing that, and to be exposed to the different language and the different nuances that happen across traditions. One of the other themes that he writes beautifully about is the necessity of understanding sacred text for ourselves. That was really a reflection of the time that he was writing in. Of course, the Catholic Church wanted us to understand what was happening in the scriptures through our priests. They wanted the priests to be the ones that held the chalice with the information, and they would hand that to us. And this book says, you go take the journey. It's not being held in that same way. He really got the nuance between what was happening with the Catholic Church and the Protestants, the development of the Protestant tradition, and that middle ground of how do I still hold my tradition and my faith with structure, but I also have my own responsibility within it, that I don't abdicate my responsibility. And that's a topical that's relevant today. He spoke a lot about the communal activity of the pilgrims. To take a pilgrimage, we do it in community. You have a beautiful community where you are. It's that paradox of it's an individual journey, but it has to be done in community, or can be done best in community. How do we weave together that paradox? He also talked about the obstacles of unintended wanderings, going down a path partway and realizing it's maybe not the direction you wanted to go, and encountering obstacles that are frightening to us. Challenges that shake the core of our belief system and how we relate to our spiritual journey, and make us say, hey, is this really even the path for me? Spiritual doubts, dangers, delays, and ultimately the possibility of martyrdom by the most ardent of pilgrims, that was not out of the question. That's not, and so we can look at martyrdom as a reality, as an absolute, and we can also look at it as a metaphor. What are we having to give up in our life to stay on this journey? What's being asked of us? So this book, it reflects the questions of faith, those existential questions that we ask ourselves. Who am I? Where am I going? How do I get there? And what's being asked of me along this journey? What am I being asked to participate in? What am I being asked to reveal? What am I being asked to trust? So all of those basic core questions of taking the human journey. It's not even the spiritual journey alone. It's just the journey of being a human in this embodied form. We're being asked those questions to give some credence and some a little more meat to why it is we're even here. What is this all about? Most of us will have those questions in our life at one time or another. And usually it's along the path. We go a ways and it's all working nicely. And then we take a turn and then we ask all those questions. And maybe we have a crisis of faith. Something really big happens in our life where we question all of the tenets and all of the structure that has made sense to us and then maybe doesn't make sense any longer. And that's all part, as John Bunyan writes in The Pilgrim's Progress, that's part of the seeker and the pilgrim's journey. Ultimately, the Pilgrim's Progress illustrates that we must choose a path and we have to walk it often in blindness. We just might not know where we're going. We may feel as though we have no sight, and still we trust, and still we have faith, and still we keep moving forward. And we encounter as many distractions and obstacles as are necessary for us to keep evolving and moving towards this ultimate place of surrender. Ultimately, that's where we're headed. And we do this with trust and faith. And faith is the journey. It's not the destination. So the spiritual journey is a journey of our life. It's not, we don't arrive, we just keep journeying. It's a process. So I guess the question to me after spending time with this book, again, after many years not having spent time with it, is I asked, does my spiritual journey mirror Christians in the Pilgrim's Progress? Does this book give me hope and inspiration for my journey, or solace? Or what does it teach me? Or how does it support me or give me a sense that this journey, my journey, is moving forward? And so that's kind of where I am, where we are.
Absolutely marvelous. Now, may I ask you to give some sense of an answer to your own question, so that we do get to hear just a little bit about your own journey, because that was such a glorious summary of the essence of that book, The Pilgrim's Progress.
Thank you. Yeah. So I would say my journey is very similar to that. I started with a very foundational Christian study, and that's where I spent many years. And I mean, I grew up in the Christian tradition as a Protestant, and then doing my graduate work. And I have an MDiv from seminary and from a Protestant seminary. And it was really about the time that I got very deep into my own tradition through my studies that I started to not question that was the path, but wonder if there weren't other layers that needed or wanted to be added on for me. That my experience, I wanted to broaden my experience of touching the divine, not to just touch through one way that it was that's being taught, but are there other ways? I always am asking, what is somebody else's experience of the divine, and how are they getting there? And I found that there are many different ways to get to the divine. And I wanted to learn more about that. So I had many questions about my faith. And one of the things that was very soothing to me was my mentor saying to me, take the time to deepen into your root tradition and then spread the roots out. But go deep first. Go know what your tradition's about. He said, it's not a cornucopia table where you just keep picking up bits and pieces. He said, you'll just be across the surface of everything. So dive in deeply to something, anything. And from there, you can reach out and you can touch many different things, but you need to be rooted or grounded in something that gives you context for experiencing other possibilities. So that gave me permission to try different things and to incorporate them into my understanding of this embodied form, why we're here. And I think that's what brought me to India, is I wanted to have, that's such a colorful and vibrant and alive expression of the divine that happens there. And I wanted to know what that looked like for people and what was their experience of the divine through that lens. But to me, there's still a solid ground under me, and that ground happens to be Christianity. It could be, whatever you're raised in, but that's what I have as my sort of my baseline. And I know that's not so acceptable to many Christians who find that should be enough. You don't actually need to journey out. But I just found that experiencing other possibilities that I could bring home and bring back myself only deepened and heightened my own tradition. It didn't diminish it in any way.
So who else wants to make a comment about their own journey as a pilgrim on their own spiritual path, or ask something of Nicola in regard to hers? We like to really recognize Robin for bringing Nicola here to talk with us. So Robin, could you ask your question or make your comment?
Nikki, darling, greetings.
Namaskaram. How are you?
Wonderful. Just wonderful to be with you. You're so articulate about a very complex subject and really bring it to life. My question to you is, I being a product of the 60s, actually, when I was in high school, and fascinated by the mysticism and the different gurus, if you will, that had come to America in that time, from Maharishi to others, and fascinated by the transcendental experiences that we heard about. Was very different than growing up at Brentwood Presbyterian Church. It was very staid and very proper and very lovely, but there was no talk of mysticism at all. And the fascination with the Eastern philosophy and ordinary humans actually having transcendental experiences was very intriguing. Years later, meeting astronaut Edgar Mitchell, who is a no-nonsense scientist from MIT. When he returned from the moon, he had a true transcendental experience that encouraged him to start seeking, because it was without, it wasn't within the parameters of the science that he knew and the understandings of theology that he grew up with. So my question to you is, as I revisit Christianity, and certainly the taproots, as you say, are very similar in religions throughout the world, forgiveness, compassion, just so many commonalities that are a training ground for being a decent human being. There is this hunger at this time in my life for, without really doing anything to get there, but wanting a transcendental experience to be bequeathed to me as an experience. My question is, with your time in India, is that something that experience is more common in Indian theologies? Because it certainly is not with all the forms of Christianity that I've explored. There's certainly people here and there that have had that kind of experience. But if you could speak a little bit to that and how one courts it, or is that a problem to court it? It might arrive as it arrives, but to have a real experience that's not just a code of ethics or a comforting philosophy of being on a Christian path, but a real experience.
Beautiful question. Well, I would say that in the Christian tradition, if we look at the Desert Fathers and we look at some of the early saints, almost any of the saints, Saint Francis of Assisi, the feminine, the women saints that we can study, they had some really deeply esoteric practices that really touched the heart, really were maybe in the same area, in the same way that you're talking about transcendent experience that was happening in the early church. So I read and study a lot about the early church fathers and mothers and their experiences. And I find that reading it can be really inspiring and really connecting me to Christianity, but it isn't the personal experience. It's reading somebody else's experience. So I think that one of the things that happens in India and other parts of the world, of course, but India is so flavorful in this way, is that you go and you have such a heightened experience, an assault actually of all of your senses, that you have to drop all of the filters that you use to make yourself available. So we put up filters. It's easier for me to experience something if I can sort of control it a little bit. But in India, it's very difficult to control your experience because the filters are stripped away from the lack of comfort. That there's just so much that is foreign and alien and
out of your control.
And out of your control. So then when you've stripped those things off, it's easier for you to have that experience. We don't have a culture here and in Christianity that strips that off easily. So it's more difficult for us to get to that juiciness, but it's not impossible. So the other thing that happens in India more prevalently is that there's a lot, and certainly in what I'm doing there, there's a lot of sadhana, a lot of practice, a lot of discipline. So we're disciplining our minds and our bodies and our experience to be more open to having a heightened experience, where that's not taught really in the Christian church in the same way. So we're not really expected to have this, blow out your mind experience by going to church on Sunday morning, which is not uncommon by just going into a temple in India. So I just think the culture is set up differently. But if Christianity is that's your heart space, that you really connect to the divine through that, and you just want more juicy, that some studying of the early saints and the Desert Fathers and their practices and their esoteric ways of relating to Jesus and the divine, there's a lot of juiciness in there.
But Nikki, that's my point. It's like we're talking centuries ago, as opposed to something in present time. And with 8 billion people on the planet, you would think you'd hear more about these kinds of things. Maybe it's a private experience, but even with all the books that are written, those are few and far between. And it's not like I'm seeking an LSD trip that comes from a divine source, but it's a curiosity of how truly rarely I hear about it. And often you go back centuries. Is it that people are mute about it and very private? Or is it just so rare? And if it's that rare, why is it so rare? And when you talk about the early, how did you call them? The wandering fathers?
Desert Fathers.
The Desert Fathers. What were I don't even know, that's my interest from centuries ago. I know what you mean about sensory overload in India, and it's overwhelming. And even though I've never been there, I have so many friends that have, and I actually don't have a desire to go. But it's not the same thing being on sensory overload in a culture that, seemingly is out of control in many ways, and the movement and the color. That's not exactly what I'm talking about. I mean, through a discipline, is it even a good idea to seek a transcendental experience? Is that even an indication of evolvement? And I never, and I underline never, with my eclectic path, with all the Roshis and all of the remarkable people that I've had the ability to meet, it's very rare that I ever, with their disciples, again, they might be mute, but I've asked them directly and they said no. Over the years, the hundreds of people that I've asked, actually, they've never had an experience like that. They've had an experience of being in communion, being part of a community, doing sadhana, serviceful work, finding satisfaction in a group, finding comfort in a theology. But I never hear about transcendental experiences, even when I directly ask. They say, no, that hasn't happened to me yet. So have you met anybody that one-on-one has had those kinds of experiences? Or may I be so bold? I've known you 25 years, but I've never asked. Have you had such an experience?
Well, you're using language to explain something that can't be explained by words.
Yes, but you know what I mean.
Well, I do. And what I'm going to say about that is that if we can't use language to explain it, then how can we be on the same table that we're describing the same thing? So I've had heightened experiences, and I know people who have had heightened spiritual experiences. Is that transcendent? Is it an awakening? Is it an enlightened moment? Those are all words. And so I would say I've had profound experiences that have happened in many different parts of the world, not just India, and that have happened in unexpected places that weren't specifically related to a spiritual moment. So I don't look at that as a goal. My goal is not to have an unexplained experience. My goal is to be in communion with the divine. And whatever happens in that, I don't give language to that, because language is limiting. So I don't know how I could compare my experience to anyone else's and say I arrived at some place. And I can only say that I've had experiences that have been really satisfying and that I may never get again. And I can't attribute them to anything other than grace. That's all. So I don't know. I don't go places and wish for that. I simply wish to be in a deeper relationship with the essence of creation, whatever that is. And what comes of it, comes of it.
Beautiful answer. I wonder if there are others amongst our listeners who want to chime in. I know many of you have had your own experiences. Many of you have traveled to many places in the world.
Nicola, I really love the presentation, and I resonated through all of it. As Renee mentioned in the beginning, I tend to be a dabbler and had a similar path. I do sometimes feel like I missed going deep somewhere. So I feel like I'm still skimming along the surface. So probably religious science as my basis, and then yoga. But I was curious, a couple things. I've only been to India a couple of times, and I have had what I would consider, since I have a history of psychedelic use, I've been to that place, but then to have experiences in India, in some of the temples that took me to that place, where I'm even getting chicken skin now, just recalling those moments, looking up at these, 3-story tall images of Rama and Krishna. And I've often wondered, what is it about that space or the experience that's connecting me in that way? But my real curiosity, because India has this rather well-distributed Christian, Muslim, and Hindu basis, is that what drew you to India, to study Christianity within a domain that has such a mixture? And then if you have any comments, I'm curious about the relationship of the prophet Isan and the possibility that Jesus traveled to India and developed sainthood there.
Okay, great. Yeah, great questions. My teacher, I was introduced to an Indian teacher about 10 years ago, 11 years ago. He was traveling here in the United States, and I went to India because he invited me to come and participate in one of his temples. So I went there for that experience, specifically not as a Christian experience. So I'm tending a Hindu temple as an expansion and as an extension of my other experiences around the spiritual journey. But I know, interestingly enough, I have met many Christians there at the ashram who are integrating Christianity and Hinduism and many other things, that they are just living their life out. It's not so dramatic there that you can't just pick and pull. You can be following several things and nobody questions that. It's not, it's not the same as it is in our culture where I'm one thing or I'm another. There you can be many things, or you can be interested or embracing many things. So I do have a lot of Christian friends, and they sit in the temple side by side with me in all the different temples in India. So I don't know, it just resonates on a different level. It's like they're two different, it's like I'm having two different flavors of ice cream. It's just different. It's, it's all good, but it's just totally different. And with response to Jesus and his traveling, my teacher gives a really beautiful talk on that. And many of other people that I've met throughout India, specifically in North and South India, but in Varanasi and also down in Kerala, they have stories and a really strong evidence that Jesus did travel in India. that he was there for quite a bit of time during those lost years where we don't know where he was. And of course, we know some of his disciples and followers did take his teachings to India. We know that. That's not, we're not speculating on that. We know that. But I think that Jesus was there. And I don't know what that means for the future and who's, going to come back and how that's going to look. And I don't know, but I feel like there's an intersection of so many different core teachings and understandings about how it is that we can be human in this embodiment. How do we do human? How do we do that? And Jesus brought that, but many other also, and also many other teachers from different traditions brought that, and they are represented in so many different places in concert. And India is just a place to be able to look at that where it's happening side by side. So we get a flavor. The flavor there is just so much stronger than it is here in our country. But we were founded on this idea of separating things, and religion was looked at differently. When we founded this country, it was not about the religious experience the way it's not an underpinning to the cultural experience here, where it is in other countries. India, it isn't even spiritual. It's just a part of daily life. The taxi cab driver has a little deity, glued to the front of his dashboard, and every single store you go into is a little, hovel, wherever they are, they've got some incense burning and a mala around some little deities on, a table, and they do a puja every morning. It's not religious to them. It's just part of that's what's so fascinating about that culture, is that it's deep all the way through the layers of your beingness. It's not just, you don't go to the temple to have an experience. The experience you can, but the experience is happening throughout the culture. It's happening everywhere you go. You can't escape it. You just can't even get away from it. It's so ingrained in the way that everything's happening. That culture and tradition, religion come together in a way that they're woven together in a way that we don't have here. We've got them separated, and you go here and you go there, and everything's very nicely in its place. But it's not nicely in its place there. It's just all meshed together. And so your experience is heightened. You can't help but have a heightened experience in that, right?
Let me call on Robert Moore, if I may. Robert?
Well, I was going to take advantage of you because you've been studied interfaith. So I wondered if you could address the problem of the exclusivity of Christianity historically, where it's the only faith and everyone else is lost, or you have to accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, and if you don't, you're lost. So how do you blend interfaith with those perspectives?
Yeah, great question. You have to take a leap. You have to take a leap of faith that you can hold more than one truth at the same time. And that's complicated, but we are required to do that in so many ways in our life already. But when it comes to religion, in the Christian tradition, we don't want to be able to do that. We want everything very black and white. And you have to just learn that for you can hold conflicting pieces of information and not have to know the exact end result of them. And that allows an expansion. Christianity, if you look at, the traditions, the monotheistic traditions are challenging. They're monotheistic. They don't want you to have more than one God and one way of living into that God. Islam is just as bad. And I'd say Judaism has a little more latitude. But still, they have, so many rules and laws. And so I think that those three traditions, which are all cousins and cannot seem to get along together, it's just so humorous to me how you can come from the same family and have I guess it's just, it's families. Families always have those problems. But everywhere else in the world, when you look at the traditions, they have all sorts of latitude that's allowed that comes in, and personal preference and the way that they're handled. There isn't such dogma. So I had to just leap. I had to trust that I could hold on to the tenets and the truth, the essence of Christianity, and still look at other and honor and have a respect and an interest to cooperate with other traditions. And all I found that did for me was just to color my world so much more beautifully. It added a wonderful depth for my experience of the spiritual journey when I stopped having to hold such tight control over something. A lot of my Christian friends don't like that. You know, they think it's just a way to do whatever you want. So I guess you can look at it however you want. But when you're leading from your heart and you are being in a discernment for yourself, then you know what's true and what's possible, and you'll just do it. You'll just go that path. And I don't need anyone to validate that or to say that it's okay. Interfaith gave me a lot of latitude to do that, because people who were operating those early days of interfaith, I mean, it was before there was even really a structure in this country around it. Everyone who was processing and practicing interfaith was open. So you weren't going to have a problem with that group. They were open to incorporating and integrating and weaving together, but they weren't about diminishing. It wasn't about saying, well, if we come into this, we're just all these little pieces and we don't really have any meaning to anything. There was an enormous amount of depth and reverence and commitment to individual traditions. So I didn't know anyone in interfaith in the early years that didn't have a root tradition. They didn't come to interfaith as like, I'm an interfaith person. That's not a tradition. Interfaith is not a tradition. So everyone in it who was willing to take that leap at that time was leaping from something. They weren't running away from it. They were leaping in order to grasp some more to bring back. So there was actually a fullness to it.
Yeah, but don't you risk excommunication or something like that?
Yeah. So my mentor in that, when I first started, which Renee had mentioned, he was the bishop of the Episcopal Church for California. And he started an interfaith program while he was still bishop, which none of us could understand how that guy got past the Episcopal Church at all. We were completely bemused, but it did. And so, I mean, maybe he had enough clout and maybe he, knew the politics or whatever, but there are people who won't like it and won't let you do certain things. And there's some churches that won't let me preach or teach in them. And then there are Christian churches that invite me open arms. So it gets down to what's happening in each of them and what's the composition of the community and how open is the community. And you're allowed to have communities that have very tight, narrow walls and communities that have very open, fluid ones. We're in a free country. You can do that. So within the Christian tradition, you'll find a huge range between those that are willing to accept diversity and those who are not, and are willing to accept a breach of what some would call the absolute end-all tenets of the Christian tradition.
May I ask you, Nicola, does it also help to look back historically to Christ's time? I understand that he was at a crossroads of so many different religious traditions, even without going to India. There were so many things going on, for example, with the Essenes and the Gnostics and so on.
Yeah.
That even within that context, there seems as though there was an enormous breadth of possible scope of belief, and that many of these religions took, for example, reincarnation as an of course. So he didn't even need to bother to talk about it because it was just part of the surrounding milieu.
That's right.
So I'm kind of wondering about that. And I also want to recognize that I saw Maurice just before I spoke up. So, okay, Nicola?
Yeah, well, the Essenes and the Dead Sea Scrolls and all of the things that came out of that were hidden away for a while, even the apocryphal writings, there's just so much out there that shows another whole side to Christianity. So if we just take the canon that has been put into our hands as the Bible, as the only experience of being an early Christian and the roots of Christianity, then we're limiting ourselves. So man got really involved in Christianity and had a big decision about what was going to be shared as our canon and what wasn't. And there are teachings that are if not in conflict, are more expansive than what we've included in the Bible. So, you know, I think, yeah, if you go back historically, you can find some much more, which is what I was really speaking to with Robin. There's some juiciness in there. You just have to go back a ways. That's not saying, you know, it's not helpful maybe today in terms of having that ultimate experience, but that's part for me of what's gotten lost in Christianity, is that the juiciness that was there from which it developed. I mean, the passion of Christ, there's nothing more passionate than how Christ lived his life in the 3 years, or, you know, the short amount of time that he was really with us, that was explosive. And then we built a whole structure around it. And that whole structure is maybe not as inviting or as, you know, juicy.
Thank you. Maurice?
Yes, I really like your metaphor about different portals or paths to the divine. And I'm wondering, in your exploration and other people's exploration, do you find that you can then identify with a greater kind of diversity and greater kind of suffering, and pulled into sort of a service that's more universal, that isn't just sectarian, and at the same time have more humility? What are the kind of qualities when one looks at searches strongly, like you have, for example, in these different portals? What kind of, sometimes they're called virtues, but what kind of qualities like this do you find either in yourself or others that you know?
Well, I could speak more to what I've seen in other people. I don't know, these may be qualities that I'm aspiring to. I can't say that I've actually arrived at them. But the ones that stand out for me in those who've trusted the process and the journey and have entered through doorways and portals that are not traditional, have had to really come from their heart space, because this is not a mental journey. If you try to analyze it, you lose all the pieces. So when you're coming from your heart space, the things you're going to see are the unconditional love and the selflessness and service, of course. I mean, Seva's a big part of what you see. People who are really doing that journey in many different ways find that human suffering is pretty, I mean, you can language it and package it however you want, but the human heart breaks the same in Christians as it does in Jews, as it does in Muslims. It doesn't matter. It's the same break. So I think the people I have seen who can walk seamlessly across those paths just carry really open heart space. Just really a lot of love comes, and there's a lack of judgment, just a lack of judgment and expectation that things or people will behave in a certain way. Because when you allow them to really respond and behave in the way that's coming naturally, and you don't already have a filter on how that's going to be, it turns out people will surprise you all the time. Turns out.
Beautiful, thank you.
You're welcome.
Kirk, did you want to ask a question?
Well, there's not much time really to go into any kind of detail, but I thought that the first question that was asked was an important one and a very difficult one to answer. But I just want to tell what now looks like kind of a humorous story in regards to my own experience, but actually was quite profound, and that I can't really put there's no way to express it in words, as Nicola has been pointing out, but it's still very interesting in relation to this discussion. And that is, I was raised Catholic, very strict Roman Catholic upbringing, and I took it very seriously. You know, I was also educated in a Catholic parochial school, and nuns and priests and so on. And I, went to church every Sunday, and I read the Bible, and I really every time I would go to church, almost, I would really want to try to have that experience of communion with this idea of Christ and who Christ was, and that sense, be filled with that sense of the divine. And it never really happened for me. It was like a blank. And even the beautiful singing, the choirs and so on, and participating. And I was an altar boy and all that. And my mother thought I was going to become a priest, because I was so serious about the whole thing. But it was still like arid for me. It wasn't fulfilling, wasn't enriching. I didn't feel inspired. And then I had I had an art teacher in high school who really started me on a whole nother journey. And he recognized something in me. He put a book in my hand. It was by Baba Ram Das called Be Here Now. You probably know about it.
Yes.
And it was just the right thing for me. And because it's, it's illustrated,
Yeah.
it's Hindu philosophy illustrated, and one of the things that it talks about is meditation as a kind of portal, right, to this deepening of one's experience of the divine. And it pointed to the Gayatri mantra as being the central prayer or a poem or mantra of all of Hindu philosophy. That is, of all the thousands of Upanishads and Vedas and so on, that particular prayer was at the core of everything. And it's been revered for centuries and was created by rishis. And these wise beings from the ancient past. And it's one of the oldest writings known to mankind. And so it was on the basis of that mantra, sitting in my room in Whittier, California, locked away from my parents, who I knew would not understand at all what I was doing, that I had this like, it was like a flower opening inwardly. And I mean, that's the only way I can describe it, but it was like, because it's a description of the divine son, right? Omnipresent, universal, within all beings, in all things. And it was like, that was like the richest spiritual experience I had. It was just in a matter of weeks of having read this book and started to try to practice meditation. So I was not like an advanced practitioner in any way. But it was just, so it was unpredictable in that sense. But I do, and in some ways, the rest of my life has been a kind of rediscovery of what that meant. And but I think it is, once you have that, even if it's just a glimmer, it can really animate. One of the teachers I had would call it a golden moment, right? And they come very rarely in your life. It could be, just a few moments in your life, but they can become defining if they're used and nourished properly and sustained. You have to sustain it. It's not like it's just the memory of it that's going to do it for you. You have to give it further depth and nourish it, water it like a plant, Yeah. Anyway, just a few thoughts, but I think that finding a text that really speaks to you and engaging in meditation on the words of those wise beings who offered it for our sake, that to me, I think, is one of the keys to having a deeper existential experience of what's being referred to.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing. That was beautiful.
Yeah, it really was.
Yeah.
Jessica, did you want to mention something before we close? I know we're at the top of the hour.
I just want to say thank you so much. Like everybody else, I was raised Catholic and saw my mom, how she was hurt by the Catholicism or telling her sins. And I have a lot of friends that are Christians and they don't believe in certain things. And I've got to travel the world. I was kicked in the butt and had a near-death experience. And I met a friend after being in pain in Bali with a boyfriend. And she took me everywhere. She said, do this. I went to Cambodia. We went to Burma together. I went to Nepal. My life does not, I was so in awe, I could have died right then. And so I want to thank you for showing the Christianity, because I got back to really enjoying Jesus and Mary Magdalene and all that is just like so profound. I mean, I love the St. Francis of Assisi prayer, but I was reading something and it said God, like that keeps me in the box. You know, I mean, I have like, I see things and I'm gotten very intuitive, but I've gotten everything that I wanted in life and I'm right here in Hawaii. I get to go back to Santa Barbara, but sometimes I feel lost and I just want to cry last night. So thank you for, you know, I mean, I don't really want to travel anymore. I mean, I love my friend that I met. She's in Vancouver, but life really did something to me. And God, I always wanted to love history. And, you know, people say, do you want to go back to India? I don't know where my life's bringing me. I'm right here. And it's just like, I got these mana cards and I'm like going, you know, I just want to thank you for making the Christianity because I put it down so heavily. And I read Mary Magdalene, I read Jesus Christ, I love, but it's something that you've joined together, that there's really people out there. So thank you.
You're welcome. They're two really beautiful books if you're interested in, you know, taking two different mindsets in the religious traditions and putting them together that I really love. One is The Second Coming of Christ, the Paramahamsa Yogananda's book, fabulous. The Resurrection of the Christ Within You, fabulous. I mean, it's a deep dive, but it's really good. And the other is Living Buddha, Living Christ. You know, they're just seeing Christ in another way. So that can change how you experience Christianity. When you start to see that other people from other walks of life and other disciplines saw some pieces of him that they celebrate and they revere, and it just heightens my experience of Christ, seeing it through their lens.
There's another book that I had, and it shows who's the one from, I don't know if he wrote the I Ching, the one from China there's Jesus, there's Buddha, and then there's another one, and it shows all how they're the same. I don't know what the book is.
Yeah, there's an anthology that compares the different themes like love and salvation and whatnot, and goes through all the passages from the major traditional sacred writings, and you can see, you know, what they wrote about love and what they wrote about forgiveness, and it's an anthology. It's wonderful. Yeah, I mean, there are just so many ways for us to weave traditions together and not lose one, that we can actually gain more depth in one by looking at it through the lens of others, that we can expand how we experience our own or a new tradition. It doesn't have to be the same. We're changing every day. We're different. Why do we want to relate to our tradition and to our spiritual journey the same way we did 5 years ago or 10 years ago?
I sat in the Thar Desert on a camel and camped, and it was when all the Muslim stuff, and there was a Muslim young guy that took us, and then a Rajasthan man came out of the bushes and they were singing. He goes, "Look, we're all together." And I just was in awe. Yeah. So if I get those aha moments, that's all I care. And I just say, I could die tomorrow. That's how I feel. It's like when life's beautiful and when I have to go through pain, I just go through the portal and shut my eyes, and I thank you. I could go.
Thank you so much.
Lovely. That's lovely. Thank you, Nicola. Thank you, Renee, and your beautiful community.
Oh, yes. I'd like to ask David if he would give a little vote of thanks to Nicola to close us off for the day.
I would be delighted and honored. Thank you so much. Not just the excellent presentation, but just the presence of what you brought. I can feel you speaking right from your heart, and such a beautiful, beautiful way to invite people into the open space that you clearly embody. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you. I will definitely come visit you in Hawaii when that's allowed.
Well, and you are always so welcome to join us each week for Gems from the Wisdom Tradition. We always welcome everyone. Next week, we are taking up the theme of the Willing Apprentice. And for that, we will be having speak to us Nilanthi Vaudeville. And she is someone who has deep experience in the field of dance. And so she's going to take from that dance tradition where she served a certain apprenticeship along the way to go to the different places that she's gone with her life. And so that will be next week's theme. The following week will be crafting our speech. We have someone who is going to speak from the Eastern traditions of nonviolence, and particularly through the application through nonviolent communication. And her name is Myrtle Wong. So we have a lot more to look forward to. We're so glad that Nicola and also Robin Rohr joined us for the first time today. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
It's
everyone.
really a beautiful presentation. Yeah.
Yes, indeed.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Renee.
Yes, absolutely. Take good care. Aloha.
Oh, aloha. Aloha, Robin.